Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Kale Zelden podcast. It's been a little bit since I've joined you all, but I have brought back with me my good friend now, my virtual space friend, Dr. Larry Chapp, to talk about things church and otherwise. I guess church and culture sort of is our jam, isn't it, Larry? Larry, how's it going in the spring there down in Pennsylvania?
Oh, things are great. A little cold spell here this weekend.
Same.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's cold
that's
and rainy up here in Rhode Island, so
crazy.
uh,
Lows
yeah.
in the 40s here, late May. Crazy.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. We as has become our new spring tradition. We have taken on a dozen new chicks, and we have recently brought them out into the full coop and integrated them, or we are attempting to integrate them with our existing flock of chickens, our hens. But we had to turn the heater on last night. It was pretty chilly. So
Yeah, you got to be careful with chicks. Yeah, we do
yeah,
that every year too. And boy,
yeah,
until they feather out, they're not
yeah.
real good with the cold. Yeah.
Yeah, no, they really are quite vulnerable. So, all right, but anyway, we're not here to talk about chickens and all things farms. Can't believe I'm having that conversation. But you've been busy and I've been busy, and so I'm just happy to get back on screen with you and chew the fat, as they say. So, I figure we could start today by talking about our German friends. Our German friends seem to be back on the scene. They never are far from the scene, either driving the scene or whatnot. But anyway, what's going on with the Germans and the synod or the synodality or what it is? I'm not really sure what all this means. What's going on here?
Well, it's extremely, in one sense, it's confusing. In another sense, it's not. I'll start
Mm-hmm.
with the confusing part. The confusing part is what Rome thinks about all of this,
Ah.
specifically what the Pope thinks about all of this. We
Mm-hmm.
know that the CDF has come out with some statements to the Germans saying, slow down. This is not right. You cannot just go your own path. You can't ordain women and have gay marriages and whatnot because that
Mm-hmm.
has worldwide ecclesial implications.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
Pope Francis has remained largely silent. And he certainly has the power as the Pope to simply put the kibosh on the entire affair and say, look, you guys have your stated purposes and all of your goal is clearly contrary to church teaching. So I'm telling you right now,
Well.
that you guys need to stand down and desist. Now,
Mm-hmm.
Rome, even under previous popes, doesn't act that way anymore.
Sure.
And I think that's part of perhaps the problem. So, anyway,
Mm-hmm.
you wanted to
Mm-hmm.
say something.
Well, yeah, I'm just for our audience's sake. I mean, let's just break down like what exactly is a synod and what is synodality and why is this sort of, these are old words. Again, my lay appreciation of these
Right.
words. These are old words, but they seem to be being employed at least in the last several years in a slightly different way. So, can you just help us break that down a little bit?
Yes, first off, here's another part of the confusion. Pope
Uh-huh.
Francis has talked a great deal about how he wants a more synodal church, and yet
Okay.
he hasn't bothered really to define what he means by that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
now we're going to have a synod on synodality, but that's been pushed into the future as well. So traditionally, a synod has never been like a miniature uh, magisterium for
Okay.
a national church. We're
Okay.
going to define morality and doctrine for ourselves, so we're going to hold a synod. I mean, the Anglicans might do that. I don't know,
Right.
but Catholics don't historically, nor do the Eastern Orthodox. Synods typically are local gatherings of bishops to adjudicate rather practical issues of canon law, of a problem that the church is confronting, either pastoral or otherwise, to develop new pastoral strategies, this sort of thing. But it's never been in the history of the church an attempt at articulating major new doctrinal and disciplinary changes in the church, that are contrary to longstanding church practice. So what the Germans are trying to do is really not what synods have historically been. Like I said, they're trying to treat this as sort of a miniature German magisterium.
And it sounds to me that people, independent or sort of, regardless of where you're coming from, if you're pro synodality or sort of synodality skeptical, um, everybody seems to think that it's kind of important, right? And
It,
even So I kind of want to steel man it a little bit. So synodalities come together as a way of sort of dealing with a practical problem. Is that sort of the way that you're
Yeah,
understanding it?
traditionally that's what synods have been designed to do, or maybe to even develop a local catechism or to
Okay.
develop local liturgies, these sorts of things that are totally in line with church practice, but just to tweak things a little bit. But the deal is here, everybody agrees that there's been too much power centralized in Rome. My good friend,
Okay.
well, my good
Yeah,
Facebook
yeah,
friend,
yeah. That's where I want to get into. So yeah, just put it in the sort of the context of why these tensions are real, and we should at least talk about it
they're
really
real
and
because,
maturely.
starting really after the Reformation and then with the Enlightenment and then the disestablishment of the Catholic Church throughout Europe, the church was on the defensive on two fronts, the Protestant front and then the rationalist, science, Enlightenment, secularist front. And so the church really did adopt a sort of defensive posture. And over the course of the past 400 years in particular, there's
Yeah.
been this hyper centralization of power in Rome in
Hmm.
order to fight. In one sense, it was a good thing.
Hmm.
It's what kept the church from flying apart into a million different directions.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
center held.
Yeah.
But there was a price to be paid for the center holding as strongly as it did. And that was this hyper centralization of power in Rome, so that Rome became like this micromanager of every aspect of the church. For example, historically, well before modern times, I mean, and into the medieval world, it wasn't the case that Rome approved every episcopal appointment,
Right. Right. I think that's good. Good. Yeah.
bishop's appointment, and so on. That is now a power that Rome has.
Hmm.
In terms, yeah, like my friend Adam DeVille, like I said, my Facebook friend, I should say,
Hmm.
and he's
Hmm.
written some wonderful books on this, has pointed out, in the Eastern churches in particular, now they don't have a pope and they don't have a central authority, so they by necessity had to develop a more localized and synodal church. But even then, their overarching rubric or hoieristic hermeneutic
Yep.
thing is the patristic era and the tradition, which they
Yeah.
hold to quite strongly, and that acts
Right.
as a regulative measure on their synodality.
Yeah.
But then everybody agrees, even very conservative Catholics agree, that we need a decentralization of power and authority
Hmm.
from Rome out into the episcopal conferences.
Hmm.
And we've seen episcopal conferences grow and that kind of thing over the past 50 years since the Second Vatican Council.
Hmm.
But it's been slow. And I'll say this, part of why it's been slow is because the theological orthodoxy of some of these bishops' conferences is suspect.
Yeah.
I think, for example, one of the reasons why John Paul put the brakes a little bit on a lot of this is because, I mean, you've got massive theological dissent all
Yeah.
over the Western world.
Yeah.
You had that crazy season after Vatican II and well
Yeah.
into the 80s,
Hmm.
everybody just making things up. That was exactly, in some sense, the wrong time to suddenly say, okay, you guys, you're going to run the church now. John
Yeah.
Paul understood that he needed to right the ship first and to stay the course. And then maybe we can talk about farming things out. And the Germans right now are a perfect example of this. Why would we want a German synod with the kind of bishops that are in Germany right now running that synod and stacking the deck in a dissenting direction?
Well,
So
where do you see the German synod movement? Where do you see them taking or attempting to take the church
oh,
by a back end
yeah,
way?
this is where it's not confusing to go back.
Okay, clarity here.
I mean, if you take a look at who they've empowered to essentially run the synod in terms of the lay groups and so forth, they've chosen all of the most radical lay groups that they could
Hmm.
choose to be
Hmm.
on here. And their goal is, I mean, you could call it a lot of things. I might call it, accommodationism with German secular culture. I mean, the head of the German Bishops' Conference himself said the reason why we need to make these changes is because there's a huge gap growing between what the church teaches and what Germans actually think. And so we need to close that gap between what Germans think, German public opinion, and what the church teaches. But so their strategy to close that gap is to simply change what the church teaches to what most Germans think. And
Well,
that's
then
so gay marriage,
why?
women's
What?
ordination, married priests, contraception,
Yeah. So all of the things. I mean, why? I'm trying really hard not to sort of immediately jump to the, well, I can, it smell, it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it
Yeah.
swims like a duck, it kind of looks like a duck to me. Why would they want to cede the explanatory power of the good news to the forces of secularism?
Because they don't believe in the explanatory powers of the good news. They barely believe in the good news. For example, as I say in one of my blog posts, it's kind of mystifying why they want to go down this path, since there is a control in this experiment, and that's the Protestant German churches, which have all
Right.
gone down this path for decades now. And those churches are almost dead.
Yeah.
It's like single-digit participation in church in those denominations, and so wherever this kind of a liberal project is applied to the church in the Western world, the church dies. It withers on the vine. I mean, you see this in Anglicanism as well. So why would they want to go down this path, which has clearly failed over and over? Because they believe it. Because
They believe what?
they believe in what Germans believe. If in other words, if you were to talk with the head of the Germans Bishop Conference and say,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you talked about closing this gap, what do you really think? Do
Uh-huh.
you believe, all right, that we should have women priests and gay marriage on its merits, not because it's a great pastoral strategy to close a gap, but what is it that you really think? And I think what you would find out is that, oh, well, this is how I really think. And that's why they're just perfectly willing to go down this path, because they're brain dead. They
I,
don't have a shred of faith, traditional, let's put it this way. They don't have a shred of classical Catholic faith left in them.
yeah. Yeah, that's sort of, it's interesting to me because for me in my head, I immediately sort of, my mind telescopes back to the apostolic era, and I'm trying to imagine, a Paul or a Barnabas or a Peter or any of the that original teaching and reaching out to not only to the Jews, of course, but also to the Gentiles. And walking into Ephesus and saying, yeah, like whatever you guys got going on, like that's really good, you should just keep doing that. Like I'm not sure that's how, I'm not sure that that's how the good news is properly articulated or spread, because I think everybody would look at you and say, well, then what are you for?
Yeah, there's a difference between looking at the culture and attempting to baptize and to take into the
Yeah.
faith those good elements of that culture. The church has always done that.
Hmm.
Okay, there's a difference between that and simply saying we want to accommodate ourselves to that culture. Worshiping Christ is a problem, therefore let's just let the Roman Christians put Jesus in the pantheon of other Roman gods, so that all this martyrdom stuff will go away and so on.
Yeah.
They didn't pursue that path. The end game, I think, for the Germans too. I think I'm guessing at this, but I think it's
Yeah.
a sound guess. They know that they're running against Rome right now. They know that this is going to create an issue, a problem, and they're willing to go ahead anyway, despite the divisions and conflicts this might create. And even if they get slapped back at the end, what they're hoping for is that other national Episcopal conferences will follow suit. What they want is for theirs to be the first pebble thrown into the pond, and then other Episcopal conferences to start throwing. The Irish, the Australians are talking
Uh-huh.
about doing this. And then maybe the Italians will do it. And then all of a sudden, you've got all these major Episcopal conferences that are all saying the same thing. We want women priests. We want married priests. We
Uh-huh.
want gay
Uh-huh.
marriage. We want
Uh-huh.
contraception. And I think the Germans are thinking at that point there'll just be this groundswell that Rome will not be able to resist any longer. So the end game is the Germans, I think, are trying to change the church from below and to force Rome's hand.
But the church is not just going to change; it's going to dissolve into nothingness. I would
It,
think,
oh yeah,
right?
what will happen is let's steel man. Let's put it this
Yeah,
way.
let's try. I want to
Steel
try. Yeah,
man, the
yeah.
worst case scenario. Let's put it that way. The worst case scenario, the worst thing is that the Germans get their way. This end game plays out. Other Episcopal conferences follow suit, and they sort of make demands upon Rome to change. Rome refuses, so these groups break away, and then you have, a deeply, deeply, deeply fragmented Catholic Church. Or, I think an even worse
Yeah.
steel man worst case scenario is Rome caves in and says, okay,
Yeah.
you're right, we should
Yeah.
do all of these things. Then you're going to have all kinds of Catholics like you and me saying, I can't abide by that.
Well,
No way.
what for a member of the sort of the quote unquote forward looking, forward thinking, forward driving German synodalist cleric and layperson, I suppose. What do they think apostasy means? Or do they have a concept of apostasy? Do they have a concept of orthodoxy, small o orthodoxy, or is it infinitely fungible and adaptable?
I think it's if you read a lot of as I do very progressive German theology that's
Yeah.
very contemporary and coming out of Germany today, most people would be stunned and shocked at.
Well, give us a flavor. I'm all
There-
ears. I don't spend
Well,
any
for
time reading.
starters, for starters, a deep, deep, deep emphasis on religious pluralism in a
Okay.
relativistic register, where Jesus does become simply one savior figure among many, one path to God among many. Furthermore, a very low Christology,
Yeah.
where
Yeah. Yeah.
Jesus,
What does that mean?
well,
Tell us
low
what that means.
Christology means where, I mean, in its lowest form, which is what you're sort of seeing right now, is that Jesus was not divine, in the sense that the Church has always historically defined that. Say at the
Uh-huh.
Council of Chalcedon, Nicaea, these
Right.
councils, Jesus is not divine, and that represents a false Greekification, Hellenization, metaphysicalization of the faith. In
Okay.
reality, Jesus was simply a man who was
Okay.
sort of maxed out on God grace. His God consciousness was maxed out. And
Right.
as such, he was sort of adopted by God as his son. It's a sort of, there's a heresy in the early church, adoptionism, slightly
Yeah.
different than this version, but it's sort of in the same genus.
It's of a piece, it would seem.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's different species, but of the same genus. And, and,
Yeah.
and
I
the
like
idea
that.
is that Jesus was not God. He was simply really kind of a maxed out human and so close to God
Right.
in his consciousness and so on that God adopts him. So we can sort of metaphorically call him divine in this derivative
Uh-huh.
sense.
Yeah.
We can
Yeah.
praise
Of course.
him and so on. But uh, he's no more special than any other major savior figure in the history of religions, or as religions perhaps without savior figures, simply religions taken as a whole, as a body of practice, as a
Hmm.
pathway to God,
Okay.
and so on. So this is one aspect that you're seeing in very radicalized progressive German theology, and clearly that's heretical. Uh,
Right.
so you asked the question of apostasy.
Hmm.
At what point, when you drop one grain of sand on the pile after
Yeah.
another, you
Yeah.
go from simply having a bits of sand to a pile of sand,
Uh-huh.
apostasy. It's sometimes hard to delineate, but when you look at it and you see, well, they deny apostolic succession, they deny.
Yet, they're all in for the positions that they hold.
Oh,
I mean,
oh,
it's an interesting denial of apostolic succession when they're sitting in seats of genuine power.
yeah, they're cutting off the saw. They're sawing off the branch on which they're standing. The
Right.
reason why they want to deny apostolic succession, there's a lot of reasons, and this
Okay.
is part of the progressive agenda. They want to declare Protestant ministries on an equal footing with Catholic ministries, so that their sacraments are valid just as our sacraments are valid.
Hmm.
And in fact, they would even do away with the language altogether of validity or invalidity. They would
Sure.
they would view that language as the older language of the ontology of a priesthood and
Of
apostolic
course.
succession. It is
Hmm.
a total downplaying, if you will, of the ontic status of sacraments as
Right.
such, as
Right.
extensions of the incarnation, uh, administered by a church in apostolic succession with holy orders. They deny all of that, where the sacraments are merely human celebrations of our consciousness of God, and human celebrations of our koinonia with one another. And
So
so that's why another thing on the Synod agenda in Germany is this wanton intercommunion with
yeah,
Protestants.
right.
Well,
And
they
so
claim, oh
the
no, we're not just going to open the door to anybody taking communion. I call
mhm.
BS on that, because if you read their theologians, that's exactly what they say. They talk about a thing called open table fellowship.
Yeah, right.
Okay,
Yeah.
and it's just out there. Do these people think that we're stupid and that we cannot read? These German bishops, I mean, when they come out with their little statements about what they're really trying to do,
Well,
nonsense.
it has all about it a real air of you know, the image that keeps coming into my head, and I'm sure I'm not. This is not new to me, of course. But this whole sort of Trojan Horse, shenanigans. That we're going to try to backdoor things, bring some things in, open some things up, and then we're going to be like, "Oopsie, well, I guess the faith of the people have spoken, and we're just going to sort of follow it along." I mean, it's all Actually, now that I think about it, it reminds me of sort of the instrumentalism of a Lenin. If you look at
Yeah.
the kind of communism of the Marxist communism of the late 19th century, the argument was it'll just happen, right? It's a sort of taking in that there's an inevitability to natural communism, and Lenin sort of and all of the Marxists, a lot of the Marxists in his era were sort of into two different camps. There were the sort of the conservative communists and the progressive communists, and
Right.
the progressive communists said, "Look, no, we actually going to have to make this happen. It's not happening in Germany where it should be happening because it's at the spear's point of industrialization and therefore alienation." But so we're going to have to go ahead and make this thing happen, and we're going to do so in such a way. With lying and cheating and stealing, we're going to make it happen, and the method is really a kind of mayhem making. So that's what I tell my friends in a totally different conversation about, when people say dismantle, disrupt, and destroy, like, we need to take them seriously, because they actually mean that, this whole dismantling and disrupting and destroying business. And I wonder if the forces in the German Synod, how conscious of this sort of machinations are they, or do they lie to themselves as well?
Well, I'm sure some of them are just not very bright, and they're just going with cultural drift, and they're lying to themselves.
Hmm.
But I think the leading lights in this know exactly what they're doing, and I think it's something analogous to what you just described, because if you watch carefully the statements that they put out, part
Hmm.
and parcel of that Marxist movement you were talking about, that we have to make this happen, is the gross manipulation of
Right.
language.
Thank you. That right. Good. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and Rod Dreher talks. I mean, "Live Not by Lies." I
Yeah.
mean, his latest book is really
Yeah.
all about. It begins with the manipulation of language,
Yeah.
where lies are told over and
Hmm.
over and over again,
Hmm.
but framed in such a way that they're using the language of older truths. And this
Hmm.
has been the modus operandi of liberal progressive Catholicism now for 50 or 60 years.
Yeah.
You use words like tolerance and dialogue and
Yeah.
Christian brotherhood, but you mean something entirely different by those terms.
And
And so you talk about, say, the Germans are now talking about Eucharist, and well, what do you mean by Eucharist?
right.
You don't mean the same thing that traditionally the Catholic Church has meant by that, and that's very clear. You don't think you need an ordained priesthood. You don't think you need any sort of doctrine like transubstantiation. You think we
Hmm.
can just have all this intercommunion with people who believe it's just a cookie. Okay, so you
So
don't.
so they don't really believe in apostolic succession in a way that you and I believe, that literally you can trace hand by hand by hand all the way back to St.
Oh
Peter and
no,
St. Paul
no,
and the
no.
gang.
It's a sort of talking point now among most
Okay.
progressive Catholics, both in the United States, Germany, wherever you find progressive Catholics. It is now a talking point that is indelibly imprinted that apostolic succession is a bogus historical idea, that there is no historical evidence of this continuous line of the laying on of hands. It's an argument from silence, because it is
Wait. What do you mean? It's an argument from silence. I don't understand that.
because it's true that if you go back into the earliest church, say, 150 AD,
Hmm.
200 AD,
Yeah.
there aren't a lot of smoking gun documents that say, and here's, the list of bishops. going all the way back to Peter and Paul and James and John. And
Hmm.
here's the line of, I mean, you get Irenaeus saying, we are successors of the apostles and so on and so forth. But the progressives will say, well, what does he mean by successor? Does he
Okay.
mean an unbroken sacramental laying on of hands? Or does he simply mean unbroken in the tradition that the apostles taught?
Why is that distinction so important?
Distinction is important is because in some sense, uh, Protestant, high church Protestant, like a Lutheran, high church
Okay.
Lutheran, would say, oh, well, we too believe in apostolic succession.
Right.
We simply mean by that we have succeeded the apostles in ministry because we are in complete agreement with what they taught. Our teaching is the same as what the apostles taught. Therefore, we are in an apostolic succession of teaching, but not of sacramental order of laying on of hands.
Okay, so for our audience, we hear that phrase apostolic, succession. Look, we say every week at Mass, I believe, one holy Catholic and apostolic church.
Yes.
Can you just remind us what do we actually mean when we profess that at Mass on Sundays?
Well, let's focus on apostolic.
Yeah, that's yeah.
The
We could talk about the other ones because I think they're attacking the other ones too. But go ahead.
Well, it means both of those things. Um, because it is true. I mean, the Protestants are not entirely wrong here, right? We do need primarily to remain faithful to the teachings of the
Yeah.
apostles. And that is the primary meaning of saying the church is rooted in apostolic authority.
Hmm. Hmm.
Jesus gave those apostles authority and they taught, and that teaching is embodied in the scriptures. And so we have to be very rooted in the scriptures and the apostolic teaching.
Hmm.
However, and this is now where you get the second meaning of that, the
Right.
properly Catholic meaning.
Yeah.
In order to preserve that apostolic teaching, you need an apostolic office in the church that shares in the same office of authority that the apostles themselves had. Otherwise, if you have no apostolic office in the church, a sacramental order, then who decides what apostolic teaching is?
Hmm.
Which is why, as soon as Luther, dissolves the apostolic office part of apostolic succession, Protestantism immediately dissolves, into thousands of different denominations because
Hmm.
everybody starts disagreeing on how to properly interpret the scriptures, the
Hmm.
apostolic deposit of faith in the scriptures.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
the Catholic meaning of apostolic is this apostolic teaching in the scriptures, also wedded to tradition, the oral tradition that the apostles handed on to those who came after them, that then develops into the concept of a laying on of hands in apostolic
Physical.
succession,
Physical.
in a
Yeah.
physical sacramental order. There is a lot at stake here. And
Yeah.
therefore, in denying that second aspect, that office aspect of apostolic succession, you have essentially articulated a Protestant ecclesiology. So I read this very interesting article. I wish I could remember the name of it or even the author of it now. But about a month ago, it was an interview with a German Benedictine who lives in Israel. He's like the abbot of a monastery in Israel. Maybe some of
Right.
your viewers will know who I'm talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. Please tell us in the
But it was
comments.
an interview with this German Benedictine who was critical of the Synodal Way in Germany. And they asked him, why is it, since the German Catholics right now seem to want to essentially Protestantize the church, why don't they just become Protestants?
Yeah.
Why don't they simply say, I, Bishop so and so of Berlin or wherever, I
Hmm.
am now a Lutheran.
Yeah.
I have decided to become a Lutheran because that is actually what they believe. And this German Benedictine said, because they know that German Protestant churches are a sinking ship, and that a lot of this has to do with power, platform, visibility, money, scratch, all of those sorts of things. So even though the Catholic Church is in very bad way in Germany right now, the Protestant churches are even in worse shape, and these guys know it. In other words, if they became Protestant, they'd be irrelevant overnight. Oh, they'd make a splash in the news up front, and there'd be
Sure.
a ballyhoo. But essentially, I mean, it's like, okay, you talk to some American nun who wants to become a priest. And then you talk to her about her ecclesiology, and you find out that her ecclesiology is essentially Episcopalian. So you say, sister, why don't you just go and become an Episcopalian and get yourself ordained as an Episcopal priest? Oh, well, I was born a Catholic and I prefer to stay in this church and change this church and so
Yeah.
on. I've had conversations with nuns like that,
Yeah.
sisters, I should say, right? And God
Yeah.
bless them. I mean, they're honestly held opinions. I harbor no animus against them,
Of
but they're
course.
wrong.
Right.
Okay. But
Yeah.
I think part of that reluctance is too realizing, well, as soon as I become an Episcopal priest, I'm no longer relevant. I'm now just one more boring Episcopal priest at some parish in Hoboken that
Right.
nobody's ever going to listen to ever again. Right now, I have a platform as a dissenter.
Yeah, I'm interested in this idea of platforms, and I wonder what is happening with platforms, and this might be a pretty good segue to talk about a bishop in our own tradition, our own faith, Bishop Barron, who has really been on the forefront of exploiting, in a good way. I don't mean that in a bad way, but exploiting and exploring the power of the various social media platforms vis-a-vis the internet. And I am impressed, frankly, by his early adoption of these new technologies and the using of this platform. And I wonder, Larry, if you have thoughts on how do you think the church will leverage or exist and live through this shakeup of platforms? And I'm thinking of platforms in terms of, YouTube channels and social media and Facebook and all of this. And how do you think this is going to interact and interplay with the traditional platform structure of the church, which is basically diocese, parish models? I mean, how do you see this being disrupted, and do you see a sort of a way through the mess?
Well, let me first begin by saying, because I'm going to talk about Bishop Barron here in a second.
Yeah.
Full disclosure, Bishop Barron is a personal friend of mine.
Yep.
I've known him for, we're not close friends, but,
Yeah.
We, theology conference friends. Let's
Yep.
put it that way.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah.
So we have correspondence. I haven't talked to him lately because he's busy and a bishop and all that. But anyway, so I just want that out there, full disclosure. And I'll say, to go back to then the question where this is going, I don't think anybody can be completely predictive, but I think
Sure.
we can see some lineament of what's on the horizon. And right now, I don't think it's good. What you're seeing is the use of the internet for the creating of platforms that have led to a sort of echo chamber balkanization of the church, where everybody finds their favorite sort of internet sort of champion of their version of the faith, whether that's, Taylor Marshall, something like that, or Kale Zelden,
Yeah, sure.
or or even in the non-Catholics, Rod Dreher, these sorts of people. Everybody has now picked their sort of champion, and so factions have developed, real divisions have developed, and that's a bad thing. Which is why I do applaud Bishop Barron's efforts in orchestrating this Word on Fire ministry. And he's not the only one. There are other places I know, like in the Diocese of Brooklyn, there's this thing called DeSales Media, which is also trying to do something similar. I know a priest who was very involved in that for a while. It's not as big a platform as Barron's. But in other words, I think Barron is showing the way in a sense, and he's saying to his brother bishops and brother priests and other lay people involved in evangelization, if we don't occupy this space is going to be occupied by others.
Yeah.
And not necessarily the most coherent or cogent of others. And therefore, Barron has been criticized for being too irenic. Let's put it that way. In the sense that Barron does not want to foment even more division.
Sure.
He doesn't want his platform to be just one more voice in this cacophony of voices. What he's, I think, trying to do is to sort of raise the bar above the fray of all of this balkanization in order to simply present the faith in these categories that almost everybody can agree upon. Now, that carries with it a certain risk, of course, where if you're going to stay above the debates, you run the risk of ignoring the debates and not really addressing them,
Yeah, I think
and
that's
just
fair.
hoping
I
that
think
your
that's
message
fair.
trickles down and gains enough adherence. But I think that's the goal, to occupy this space and to occupy it in very classy ways, very professional ways. I
Yeah,
mean, my
yeah,
God, the production values of what they
yeah,
produce is just astounding.
yeah. It's top
Uh,
rate. It's top rate for sure.
yeah, and I know, that his Catholicism series is used all over the place by people and so on. So I think that's what he's up to, and it's to fight against this balkanization. And of course, there's a lot of blowback against him
Hmm.
by those various divisions and camps that we're talking about.
Well, so what do you think that's about? I mean, I've, I've known about Bishop Barron when he was Father Barron back in the late '90s. I think I stumbled across him. I went to a conference and heard him give a talk on Flannery O'Connor, which is one of my loves. And I've long been impressed with him. I've been on his mailing list forever. And I've always really appreciated his work. I've always appreciated his depth and his breadth. I've always appreciated his willingness to engage. We can come back to this sort of question of engagement later on. And so I've always been a fan. And when anyway, so I want to put that on the table too. Um, because I do think that he's been really fantastic. Um, but I got but I do have issues.
Go ahead. Let's talk
I'd
about
pick with him a little bit, you know, and I think by way of getting at this, you wrote a piece in the second portion of the Universal Call to Holiness series on your blog at gaudimetsbest22.com.
Thank you.
Yes, about his video that he recorded with Jordan Peterson, YouTube fame, etc. And I left that conversation feeling kind of a couple of things at the same time. I felt energized that these two guys that I admire for kind of different reasons got together. Both of them have massive platforms. To get back to this platform business, Peterson is in terms of the virtual space bigger, but the fact that Barron is a bishop gives him both the platform in the terrestrial reality as well as his Word on Fire media is also quite large. But I left that conversation sometimes feeling great, and then sometimes being kind of just really kind of deeply disappointed in the whole conversation. And I don't know, I've thought a lot about it since then. You say in the piece that you believe that Barron catches flack from sort of the trad space warriors because he's so effective as an evangelizer. And I'm going to give you an opportunity. Like, what do you mean by that? Because I'm not sure I'm convinced of that argument.
Well, I think that let's put it this way: they know that he's successful. And so, to get this off the table, I think
Yeah,
a lot of the criticism from YouTube people like Taylor Marshall is they're
yeah,
riding on his success's coattails for clicks. I mean, if as
yeah.
I
But all of his
said,
clicks,
if
all
I
of his
said,
clicks.
oh yeah, if
Okay.
I said in my last blog post, I mean, if you want a dog whistle that is going to gather together traditionalists, just mention the name of Balthazar or Baron, and boom, you're going to get clicks, 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 clicks.
Oh,
And
massive, massive.
and I think so that's part of it. They sense, oh well, this is going to get some clicks. But okay, let's leave that aside, because now I'm questioning motives and I have no inside knowledge of their
Well,
motives.
look, the incentive structure is clear, and you need to get clicks. I mean, but I don't think it's
And so I think it's
just
legitimate
cynicism. I don't
thing,
think it's just cynicism.
but I don't want to go down that road, because
Yeah,
it does, people can question perhaps my motives too with my
yeah.
blog and all that.
Me,
So
me,
I
me
don't,
too. Yeah.
so that's a thought, but I think the real thing that they're noticing is he's effective, but they're afraid that what he's being effective at is a watered down version of
Yeah.
Catholicism.
Okay. I think
And
that's basically right.
so
I think that's basically
I've
right.
been clear in my blog. You're right to call this out, because it's not quite clear, because it makes it sound like, oh well, they're jealous of his
Yeah.
success and they're afraid of it and so on. Nah, No, the steel man, their argument, what they're saying is this guy is very visible. He's a bishop. He's got this massive media platform, and he uses it to push this beige, as Eric Salmon said in Crisis Magazine, the bishop who complained about beige Catholicism has now gone beige himself, which is not
Hmm.
true in my opinion.
Hmm.
But nevertheless, that's the criticism.
Yeah, that's the criticism,
And
right?
he's peddling this super palatable form of Catholicism that doesn't really ruffle anybody's feathers and so on. And so they're afraid that it's a kind of wishy-washy kind of Catholic faith that he's pushing. And so I think that's why they're not really impressed with his success in one sense. In another sense, they are afraid of it because they think it has a baneful influence on the church, especially with regard to the so-called charge of universal. He's not a universalist, but they all say that
Yeah.
he.
What do you think they're scared of? I think because I think that is getting at what it is, and I want to be fair to that fear because I do think it's probably worth talking about.
Well, I think that it is a very legitimate fear, not with regard to Barron, but in.
Yeah. Right.
And my problem with their critique of Barron is that they, I think, illegitimately lump him in with what is a very legitimate observation. That the modern church, as I mean, you and I have just been talking about it, the
Yeah.
modern church is borderline an apostate church in many
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah.
And it is the product of 60 years
Yeah.
of this pablum, these
Yeah.
anodyne bromides from the bishop, this watered down. I mean, I blogged endlessly about it. Bourgeois, beige, modern
Yep.
Catholicism,
Yeah.
ad nauseum. This has been my shtick.
Yeah.
All right. So I share deeply that concern. I don't even want to call it a fear, but a deep, real, legitimate concern on the part of traditionalists that the church has gone off the rails pastorally in many, many, many ways. I simply have a sharp disagreement with their proposed remedy to that problem.
What is their remedy?
Well, I think their remedy is to say, well, since all these problems happened Vatican II forward,
Yeah.
therefore the problem is Vatican II and forward.
Yeah.
And so we
Yeah.
need to go before Vatican II and reconstruct. This is a bit unfair, but I think it captures the essence.
Well.
Nobody, and I know among the better lights of the traditionalist movement, thinks that we should just resurrect 1930s Catholicism all over again. I don't want to be unfair to their position. But
Yeah.
on the other hand, it is very clear when you start reading online debates amongst traditionalists themselves about what is the more valid liturgy, the pre 1955 Tridentine Mass or the post 1955 Tridentine Mass.
Right.
And then you begin to and we need to go back and retrieve Pius the Ninth and Pius the Tenth syllabus of errors and all these and we need to retrieve Gary Lagrangianism, neo-scholastic manuals. We need to get rid of all these resource mont guys like De Lubac and Balthasar and stuff. And then a picture begins to emerge of a belief that the answer is to simply bring back all of these older elements into the modern church. Now, I think they're correct about some of those elements. I think like we could use a real liturgical update if you ask.
Yeah. It's funny. I always, when I have these conversations, when you and I start getting into this sort of thing, I feel like there's nothing neat and clean with this because you and I are, I think, are very sympathetic in some very real, substantive ways with our traditionalist friends. But I think both you and I are dissatisfied with, coloring with the wide-tipped marker that is required in order to sort of just go back to 1930s Catholicism. It's not that simple.
No, and that's why in a few of my blogs I've made note of the fact that and we've talked about this on here too, one of the reasons why the church sort of collapsed almost overnight, and I lived through that era, and let me tell you, it was almost overnight after Vatican II, was precisely because the church before Vatican II, in which all of those people that were in the collapse were formed, was not that healthy.
Yeah.
There were huge problems in pre-Vatican II Catholicism. And you can go back to authors like the French novelist Georges Bernanos, for example, wrote Diary of a Country Priest, lamenting the absolute lukewarmness and insipid superficiality of the Catholicism of his day. I mean, go and read French Catholic, German Catholic, British Catholic intellectuals of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and you do not see one long hurrah for our church, isn't it glorious? It was one lament after another about how
Mhm.
forensic the faith had become, how empty, how legalistic, how devoid of an inner evangelical spirit that it was. And
So,
it reaches that last point,
yeah,
1950,
yeah.
Joseph Ratzinger, a young theologian,
This is
writes
58. Is that 58?
58
Yeah,
before
yeah,
the council.
yeah, yeah.
Joseph Ratzinger, in one of the first articles he ever wrote for a theology journal, writes this bombshell article called "The New Paganism in the Church," which is detailing every which way that the church had been corrupted from within. You talked about Trojan horses, had been corrupted from within by this bourgeois, lukewarm, sort of forensic attitude. And this is Ratzinger already in 58 writing things like this. So that's why I said I'm sympathetic with traditionalists, but their recipe calls for a glossing over of why the council was called in the first. The council made mistakes, but I think there was a real need for at least some kind of a council to sort of grapple with some of these issues.
Yeah, and perhaps, yeah, it's funny, because you can be right and wrong almost at the same time here.
Yeah,
um and so, when I hear, going back to Barron, because I do think this is all of a piece, because if you look at what Barron has done in the last 2-3 years, he's really doubled down on the Second Vatican Council. And I think, for some reasons, and in some ways, I think for very good reasons. In other reasons, I'm skeptical. um and again, I know I'm using kind of loose terminology. There's the actual council, there's the interpretations of the council through vis-a-vis the papacies of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and now Francis. There's all these sort of things going on. There's the changing in the liturgy. There's all of that stuff. And it's very difficult to keep all the various threads clear and distinct when
oh
when you're
yeah,
having these conversations. But I watch people get all fired up about Barron, and it seems to me there's this frustration that, look, like, we know what Supich is, we know what McElroy is, we know what these, Tobin in Newark, we know what these guys are. We don't expect anything from them, but
right.
we know who you are, and we expect, like, more from you. Like, I think that is part of this frustration they have with Barron. Perceived. I don't know if it's always fair. But Barron's a bishop, and I still maintain that it's really, really weird that Father Barron became a bishop.
I know.
God, I would love to know the inside story as to how all of this shakes down. But what I have grown frustrated with is Barron's seeming willingness to bury the lead, or swallow the truth in the spirit of collegiality with his brother bishops. And I personally, this is me, Kale Zelden, I personally think that the desire for public collegiality has been a disaster for the church. And what
Yeah,
I mean by that is, I have an extremely difficult time, someone who is trying to live a good and faithful Catholic life in 2021, raising 3 young kids. I'm married, I'm teaching, I work in a Catholic institution. I'm trying really hard to sort of witness to the brand, if you will, and ultimately
yeah,
witness to Christ. I have a really hard time when I see Bishop Barron, for instance, recommending a book from Father James Martin. And
yeah,
and like that, I have been very careful with my conversations about Barron, because I've always thought that he's been kind of a net good, and he brings, like, all those things you're talking about. He talks about beauty, he talks about literature. These are all things that are close to my heart. But he comes out and he's going to be fraternal with that. Like, I really struggle with that one. I mean, well, I don't know what your thoughts are on this. I just
well, first,
that. Go ahead.
okay, first the issue of sort of bishops never criticizing one another in public. I did one of my blogs. They're all running together in my head now.
It's okay.
I talked about how useless the USCCB is. I said it's
Hmm.
as useful as a defibrillator in a morgue, uh, because yeah, they spend all their time. Um, it seems to me talking about endless topics over which they have no expertise
Yeah,
of it.
none.
And then a topic comes along that they should deal with, say Eucharistic communion for Catholics who believe in prenatal homicide.
And let's just punt. Let's just
Yeah,
punt.
let's just punt that one while we issue another statement about the border or climate change or
Right.
something like that. And those are important issues, but
Yeah.
those are not issues over which the bishops have all that much sway or authority. And then, of course, then there's the issue of them never agreeing to criticize one another in public. My God, you go back to the early church and bishops really
Yeah.
anathematized each other.
Well, I mean, not to mention, Peter and Paul, kind of
Yeah.
got into a couple of scraps that were kind of important.
Yeah, they did, and they call each other out publicly and so forth. I
Yeah.
also noticed, though, notice this, and we'll get back to Barron in a second. Uh, the liberal wing of the Catholic Church, the Supich, the Tobins, the McElroys, the Wilton Gregories, they
Yep.
don't seem to have any trouble calling out the conservative wing.
No, not at all. No.
I mean, just this past week, the 60 bishops that signed that letter to, Gomez saying, you can't talk about this Eucharistic stuff. We need to, blah, blah, we have to have consensus and so on. Well, they're trying to develop a consensus. And who the heck are you guys
Yeah.
so in some ways, I'm going to say I'm happy that they issued this because now a few other bishops have come out and said, hey, wait a minute, pal. And we have every right to want to talk about this. So, in some ways, I think that balloon has been punctured a little bit. Some
Yeah.
of these divisions are beginning to come out, and so I think that's a good thing. Now,
Mm.
and also, by the way, I can't stand James Martin, and I think he is extremely harmful in the church right now. And
Can you give me a 2 minute thing on this, because I do, I'm sure anybody watching the show will not be surprised at all that you and I have our problems with Father Martin and his project, but if you could just sort of do a quick layout of it
well,
from your perspective.
from my perspective, is that he's dishonest.
Yeah.
He's in a sense playing a very strange game where everybody and their pet hamster knows that he disagrees with the Catholic Church's teaching on homosexuality, the actions being a sin. He's complained about the language of the Catechism,
Yeah.
and every single time the Church appears to greenlight homosexual actions in life, he's all over Twitter saying hurrah,
Yeah.
hurrah, hurrah. And we need to build this bridge to the gay community. I'm all in favor. I have lots of gay friends, and the last thing in the world that I would ever want is for a single one of them to have a hair on their head harmed in any way
Of
by
course.
some
Yeah.
bigoted jerk,
Absolutely.
nut job.
Right. Right.
All that said, they know where I stand on their sexuality and their lifestyle and so on, and they respect mine. So I have no problem with the idea that the Catholic Church needs to minister
Of
to
course.
LGBTQ people, or I plus IA, whatever. I have no issue with that, and we should. But Martin wants to go beyond that, and that's very, very clear. And so he flies just below the radar of dissent by never publicly saying, I disagree with church teaching and I want it to change. And that's how he gets away with these public endorsements from these various bishops. Now,
Well, and photo ops with the Pope.
and photo ops with the Pope and so on. So, I'm loath to criticize my friend, Robert Barron, for endorsing a book by James Martin because, in some ways, this is Robert Barron's MO, for better or for worse.
This sort of winsomeness, you mean?
Well, yeah, he doesn't attack.
Yeah.
Barron is not a pit bull. He's not a pugilist.
Except he will attack trads. He
No.
has punched down on trads. The very interesting talk he gave at I believe it was the Napa Institute, where he went after the various trad YouTube stars. I was really taken aback by that, because you and I are now on record, of course, saying like I have major issues with
Yeah.
the Taylor Marshes of the world. I appreciate some of the things they do, but I have deep problems with the whole their project. But fascinating that he would come out and punch down on them pretty seriously in a way that he would never ever do with his brother bishops and someone like Father James Martin.
Well, none of his brother bishops, nor has James Martin, ever publicly engaged in ad hominem attacks against him in
Sure.
vile and vicious and ways that border on calumny.
Hmm.
Uh, and 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 therefore
I
I'm
don't
going
think I don't think it was always so. To be fair to those guys, I mean, I've seen a lot of their videos from back in the day. I think it's I think a lot of that public name calling has come in the aftermath of that Napa Institute
really.
speech he gave. Yeah, to be fair, I want to be fair to them because I remember listening to some shows. This is like 2-3 years ago. It really was in the aftermath of the McCarrick mess, and that's really when I first started listening to Taylor Marshall and Tim Gordon and some of these other fellows, and they were saying all the right things, and I was really a fan of what they were saying. And they, on many occasions, were like, man, Bishop, because I think he'd just been named Bishop. We'd love to talk to you about some of these things. Da da da. So initially it was not so. Initially it was not what I agree is turned into public bordering on calumny. But anyway, I'm interrupting you. Sorry.
Oh no, I'm very interested because I don't think I've seen the talk that you're referencing, and
Yeah.
I'm ignorant of the exact timeline of where
Mhm.
things break down when the attack started and when they didn't start. So
Yeah.
I'm actually listening. I'm very
Yeah.
interested
Yeah.
in your account because I actually haven't followed it all that carefully. I've just and you mentioned Taylor Marshall. I mean, that's a guy
Mhm.
that's evolved. Let me tell you. I mean,
Yeah.
you go back
Yeah.
7, 8, 9 years, and Taylor Marshall's a big. We have to support Vatican II. We have to support,
And Pope Francis. I mean, what's so interesting about his
yeah,
his
all that.
development? It was really not until around 2019 that
Eric,
he started really going, and it was even yeah. It really was a late 2018 and into 2019 where he tacks seriously toward sort of official rad tradism, if you will, for lack of a better.
Eric
Uh,
is there, followed by Vegano.
yeah, right. Okay, I think that's and look at to put myself, to put me, out there a little bit. When I read the McCarrick thing, really blew me up too. And that's in the one piece that I wrote in the last year at 1 Peter 5, I talk specifically about McCarrick destroying my comfortable frame, so to speak.
Yeah,
Um,
a lot of
but yeah, but in the aftermath of that, he was always, Taylor Marshall was always sort of Latin Mass ish, but was very pro Pope Francis, was very pro, the whole thing, and he obviously made a real break. And then I think it was Easter of last year. I think it was during Corona, it was during the COVID lockdowns where I think he went full. I always get this wrong, and this is where I lose my credibility with my audience. I think was the FSSP, and what is the
yeah,
other one?
the
There's one that,
FSD and then the Christ the King. There's,
yeah. Well, he went full. He
oh, the
broke.
FSPX,
Yeah,
Lefebvre.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. He went.
well, that's where Gordon broke off with him.
That's correct, right? And so, and in the grand scheme of things, I listen to Tim. Tim's a little much for me, but I like Tim. I think he's basically a good guy, and he is at least seriously attempting to think with the church and pray with the church. And I don't see the same thing in Taylor Marshall for sure. And they're not friends anymore, for the record. I
Well,
mean,
Taylor Marshall's definitely jumped the shark at
yeah,
some point. Uh,
well, yeah, he
when he starts
has,
selling on his videos, Team Vegano coffee cups
yeah.
and T-shirts and stuff.
But you're so right. So so when Vegano first came out, it was in the aftermath of the McCarrick thing, and if you look like now, what does he have, like 20 different letters now that he's put out there, and they've all gotten increasingly odd
Dang.
to be, and yeah. But those first couple, man, they were energizing, and it was like this guy is talking like an apostle. And he was talking explicitly about the need for the church to come clean about McCarrick, and people knew stuff and all that. So for me, like, I didn't have the mug, but I was all team
Oh, me
vegan
too, man.
after the first 2-3 letters. And so I think as Vegano went in my appreciation in a deranged path, I think somebody like Marshall sort of followed suit.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to get back to Bishop Barron in a
Yeah,
second.
yeah, yeah,
But yeah, I think that, I think a lot of us who are traditionalists were very energized by those first
yeah,
couple of letters from
yeah,
Vegano going, at last, my goodness, an archbishop who worked in the Vatican
yeah.
closely with popes blowing a whistle on some of this corruption.
Right.
I think tons of us were like, you go, you
Yeah,
go.
yeah, yeah,
I talked to my pastor at the ordinariate church
yeah.
that I attend, like, wow, and he, yeah. And, but then, then the drip, drip, drip of
Yeah.
insanity started. Like, oh, wait a minute, Vatican.
And I think from an historical standpoint, I think it's important, hopefully when all the history of all this tempest in a teapot, I think it's more than that actually, but I think when, I think it is hard to separate this from the coronavirus insanity, the lockdowns and all of it.
Yeah.
I really do think it's all of a piece. I really,
Well, that's why
just like,
latest letters are all about coronavirus and the
yeah,
big reset and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
George Soros.
Right, right.
And maybe it's all true.
Yeah, right. Who knows? Right, but I think
We
in
look,
terms of
if it turns out all to be true, it's a plot controlled by Freemasons and
there it is,
in
the Alta
the
Vendita and all the stuff,
Wuhan Freemasons inflicted.
Yeah. So anyway, so I've seen all this sort of stuff blow up, and I was always I've not read as much von Balthasar as you have read, but I always knew that this was a weird sort of straw man that some of the trads were using and Marshall was using. And they still talk about von Balthasar. They think like his whole project, is, dare we hope that all men are saved, as if like that was sort of this crowning achievement. And it's, as you have pointed out, it's at best, it's speculative. And you yourself as a von Balthasar sympathetic thinker, you don't really agree with his speculation in that book, but I mean his whole corpus is massive and has nothing to do with all of this stuff. But now in trad world, the only thing von Balthasar ever did apparently was sort of resurrect origin.
Yeah, I want to correct one thing. I mean, I don't disagree with what Balthasar says in Dare We Hope. I just have some quibbles with. I think
Okay, fair.
better to say some of the stronger language. In other words, I can sort of understand how some people reading that would say, "Wait a minute, all right."
Yeah.
So I can sympathize with that. But what he articulates in that book is far downstream of the main ecclesiology, Christology, where he's very, very, very orthodox. And so it upsets me when I see this is actually a theologian traditionalist that you should pay attention to.
Yeah.
He's one of your best friends in the tradition. Don't fixate on this one aspect of his theology.
And it's the same. And it's the same thing with somebody like de Lubac and some of these other guys. Like they've become demonized for some weird falsely historical reason, as if like they're the baddies. And I'm like, man, you guys are just you're not being serious about this. You're not being serious.
Yeah, you're not being serious. And there's not a whole lot of serious digging either. I mean, take the title of Balthasar's book, Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved. The actual German title is Was dürfen wir hoffen, which means what are we allowed to hope for? Not dare we hope. What are we allowed to hope for? In other words, he's placing his theological speculation under the umbrella of what does Revelation allow us and the church's magisterium allow us to hope for here. By going with Dare We Hope, it seems like he's like taking this adventurous stab at something on the fringes, and I'm going to take my stand. No, it's was dürfen wir hoffen? What may we hope? What possibly can we hope? And therefore, his conclusions, I think, are far more provisional than what some of the trads make it out to be. But
bring it back to Barron here. I think that's the
bring it back to Barron. I want to point something out with regard. I mean, I'm not going to be able to articulate a defense, and I clearly want to defend him because I love the guy. He's a great guy, friend, as I said, and I believe passionately in the project that he's about. But I can't address everything. But I will say this: I want to point out to a big picture thing. Oftentimes, when we're trying to critique the style of an evangelist, and that's what Barron is. He's an evangelist. We tend not to pay enough attention to who their main audience.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think this is exactly right. And this hit me in the middle of his conversation with Peterson, but please go ahead.
Yeah. A Taylor Marshall he's evangelizing in his own way.
Yes.
He's got a different target audience.
Yep.
He's going to be a lot more like a Father Altman, a sort of pugilist, and say, this is what we should be doing, a
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
two-fisted Mike Voris scream at the screen sort of
Mm-hmm.
Catholicism. And okay, you're talking to a different kind of audience. You're talking to a
Mm-hmm.
very sort of male-dominated audience in many, many
Mm-hmm.
ways of
Mm-hmm.
people who want that. But that's not Barron. Barron's focus is on those Catholics who need to be re-evangelized because they have been adulterated by the culture. And his target audience are those sort of secularists of goodwill who have some interest in things spiritual and theological and even perhaps Catholic, which is why when Barron teaches and when he preaches and when he engages in interviews with people like Mike Voris or Ben Shapiro, that
Mm-hmm.
famous interview,
Yep.
I mean, the pugilists want him to come out and say,
You
Jesus
must. Yeah. You
you know,
must convert.
okay,
Yeah.
okay, all talking aside here, Jordan, or all talking
Yeah.
aside here,
Yeah.
Ben, you must accept Jesus Christ and his Catholic Church, or your soul is going to be in jeopardy.
Yeah.
That- You know what? That would be an immediate turnoff to
Of
both of
course.
them and to
Yeah.
the audience that he's trying to reach. Now, I was a teacher in a classroom for 20 years and taught exactly that same audience. And I think this
Yep.
is why I'm so sympathetic to
Yeah.
Barron's project, because
Yeah.
I know it works. And I know, I mean, I taught at a Catholic school, but man, it was the great unwashed masses in
Of
terms of
course.
you teach high school, you know what I'm talking
Yeah, I
about,
do. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
teaching theology. And
Yeah.
I learned very, very, very quickly that the main thing you have to do when you teach is not to punch people directly in the face or to present, just toss catechisms at them. And that's,
Yeah.
you have to flip the script
Yeah.
that's playing in their brains. And that
Yeah.
means you have to engage in subtle and a bit gentle cultural deconstruction so
Yeah.
that you can then introduce them to certain gospel truths as the answer to what you've just deconstructed for them.
Yeah.
This is Barron's project as well. He's not simply going to come out with a full-throated sort of that's why he doesn't condemn, or he maybe punched down at the traditionalists. I'd have to take a look at that. And why he would do that and so forth. By the way, to go back to that, and I'll get back to the target audience in a second. Even
Yeah.
though you may not have seen a lot of YouTube attacks on Barron before that talk that he gave, I guarantee you, I make you a bet that he had already received voluminous emails
Oh yeah. Gosh. Yeah.
various
Of course.
people
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
attacking him and so on. And to his credit, I think one of the reasons why perhaps he was punching down, if you want to put it that way, at
Uh-huh.
traditionalists isn't just because, oh, he's thin-skinned and he finally got tired of the ad hominem attacks. I think he began to see the influence the traditionalists were having
Yeah.
was growing and growing and
Yeah.
growing, especially after the McCarrick thing hit the
Yeah.
fan. And I
Yep.
think he became genuinely concerned. Wait a minute. This is not healthy for the church. Now, with regard to him and Vatican II, I think to go back to all this balkanization and all of these factions and right or wrong criticisms of the traditionalists, I think what Barron is seeing as he looks out on the church is a church that needs some sort of Ariadne's thread. All right, you've got to have, in other words, he's a big believer in the hermeneutic of continuity,
Yeah.
and therefore a big believer in the papacies of John Paul and Benedict in particular, and their retrieval of this council. What I would say is this: he's not going to highlight all the problems that the council.
Yeah.
Although I have heard him give talks where he says, similar to what I've said, that the council may have been a bit naive about this and a bit naive about that, but he's going to steelman the council, and he's going to highlight. Here's why this is the Ariadne's thread of the modern church that we need to still pay a great deal of attention to. Because, folks, there is no going back to 1905. There is no going back to the Index of Forbidden Books. There is no going back to that form of Catholicism. Nor is progressive Catholicism the answer. Nor is the Latin Mass all by itself the answer. We have to hitch our wagon to Vatican II, JP2, Benedict, and to a certain extent, even Pope Francis. We have to hitch our wagon to that. Whether we like it or not, we have to retrieve what is the best about that. So he's steel-manning Vatican II. But I guarantee he's enough of a scholar, and he's a very good scholar. I co-edited a book with my colleague Rodney Hauser called How Balthasar Changed My Mind, and he wrote a chapter in that book that was the most brilliant chapter in the entire book. And let me tell you, there were some heavy hitters in that book. The man is no slouch on a scholarly level. So I guarantee you, he knows that Vatican II has certain problems. But I don't think, once again, for evangelizing purposes and for the health of the church, I don't think he's going to go out and start saying, well, the council got this wrong and the council got that wrong. Maybe he should. I mean, maybe.
Yeah,
Maybe,
that's my question. Yeah, and
maybe he should. Maybe he will eventually. Who knows?
yeah, and I think this has this what you're laying out here has certain explanatory power for me at least. You know, I can see where you're coming from on it. But he says in the middle of that Jordan Peterson interview that he really loves going on these sort of Reddit slams, like talking to atheists online and mixing it up and scrapping it up with them. And I think that I realized in that moment that he's probably not for me. You know,
Right.
and like that's okay. I'm totally fine with that. Like, you know, I'm on his Word on Fire list, and my gosh, that is that. I mean, he has all these new fellows, and he's got all these new books that are coming out, and all these sort of things, and it's a little much for me. I feel like it's really slick and it's really polished, and I can't believe I'm complaining about this because I'm a big believer in professionalism and
Yeah.
all that. But it is a little bit much. But I guess I just walk away from it realizing, well, I guess he's not for me. Um,
Yeah. And I
what
think
you
he'd be okay with that.
yeah, no, I that's exactly right. But I think then it begs the next question for me as a traditional minded Catholic: who is
Who is what? I'm sorry.
for who's for me?
Oh, who is
Because all I get is, you know, I'm rigid. You know, I'm psychologically imbalanced. I'm a sentimentalist. I'm, you know, I don't care. You know, all those things. And it's like,
that
all right,
sounds
well,
like some of the seminary evaluations I got from 40 years ago when I was,
there it is. There it
you're
is.
you
Yeah, you know, and it's like, okay, like I don't know. So
realize.
maybe that's part of my upset. But you
Uh,
know, I'm looking at these two guys now. I've spent a lot of time watching Peterson and a lot of time watching Barron, and I'm looking at these two guys, and I have, you know, like I said, I really do have deep respect for both of them, but I can't help but feel like both of them are kind of working their gig. They're working their angles, and Peterson, frankly, just sort of strikes me as a more authentic person, as a more authentic
Peter's,
yeah,
well,
personality on the
that
YouTubes.
might be true in terms of how they come across in terms of style.
Hmm.
But Jordan Peterson does not have the constraints in terms
Fair.
of what he can say in public that a bishop of the Catholic Church might have,
Hmm.
or any Catholic
Okay,
might.
so but that's a deal you make, right? I mean,
Yeah,
you know,
but
that's what I mean. Like that's why I keep in my head. I keep going back. What do you have to sell to become a bishop?
it,
And I wonder if there's not a little bit of good old fashioned simony, or the smell or the aroma of simony sort of lurking in the background. And I know I'm being kind of unfair here, but it really smells that way to
oh
me,
no,
man.
forget Barron for a second because I have no idea how he
Yeah.
became bishop or what the backstory to that is. But I can tell you one thing: it's not because Bishop Barron kissed anybody's petards because he was an upwardly mobile ecclesiastical climber.
Yeah, no, I know he's different than the normal. That's, I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
he's
that's not
not,
him at
you
all.
know, I don't know.
Uh,
Did you see
I
that
think,
Sticka? Did you see that Sticka interview in the
oh,
Pillar last week?
I
Oh
did.
my gosh!
That
So
is,
like, yeah, so he's not Barron is not that, for
but
the
it does
record.
raises a huge general question about how did bishops become bishops?
Yeah,
That office in Rome, and now, my goodness, Tobin and Supich are now
right.
on the Congregation of Bishops.
Yeah,
One can only imagine what kind of American bishops we are now going to get. It's crazy.
yeah.
It's sad. It's pathetic.
It's
Uh,
not good. It's not good, audience. It's
I
not
just want to
good.
leave one thing here with regard to Bishop Barron, who I said
Yep.
friend of mine and big believer in Word on Fire, is this that I mean everybody has their different vocation or their different charism,
Hmm.
and vocations and charisms aren't necessarily oppositional to other vocations and charisms. So you get a person like me, for example, who is a huge devotee of Robert Barron, a friend, someone who believes in Word on Fire. And if I might have a few disagreements with this, that, endorsing James Martin's, but whatever, I don't know. I'm just going to file that as a one-off anomaly, and I'm not going to concern myself with it. So, I got that with regard to Barron. But then you take me, this big fan of Barron, and then in my blog, I'm pretty much a two-fisted pugilist.
Yes.
I mean, the number one complaint that I get from traditionalist readers of my blog in particular is, who can take this seriously? It's so filled with snark and acerbic comments and snottiness and snow.
That's
So,
rich.
well,
Rich.
first off, it's a blog, and I'm trying to be a little bit humorous and pointed, because you want to hold people's interest. If I were writing an academic paper, I wouldn't write that way. But as a couple of my fans who do like what I have said, Chapp is a brawler, and we sort of like that. So I'm in a sense, I'm nowhere near Bishop Barron's intellect or what he's achieved, but I'm sort of what Barron would look like if he were me. In a sense, I think I'm the pugilist version of Robert Barron. All
Well,
right.
right.
Well, that's my point about charisms aren't necessarily oppositional.
Right.
Barron is setting a tone. He's creating this network. He's evangelizing in a certain way. And if there's other people who believe in what he's doing, who then want to get down in the trenches and say, hey, wait a minute, Taylor Marshall, you've just mischaracterized and misrepresented what, in a recent interview, Marshall and Father Altman, they both, once again, dragged up that Ben Shapiro interview.
It's like every time.
And said that Barron was arguing for religious relativism. Father Altman said he thought Robert Barron, based on his interview with Shapiro, is a heretic who needs to be excommunicated. This is Father Altman.
That's crazy. That's crazy.
He's a heretic who needs to be excommunicated. And there's Taylor Marshall nodding his head up and down and that sort of thing. So I'm not going to let that pass. I'm going to come on your show and I'm going to say that is absolutely idiotic. That is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard anybody say. So I'm a brawler. I'm a pugilist. But
part of the reason why you're a brawler, Larry, number one, you have the chops, intellectually and sort of emotionally, and you can sort of summon those powers appropriately.
And the disposition.
Yeah, but you also you don't give a rat's behind about status or power. Nobody has money on you. Like, you don't care about those things. Like, you do your thing. Like, you're not being threatened. So you have no governors other than your own sort of good sense. And I'm sure whatever your wife tells you, hey, Larry, calm it down on X, Y, and Z. I mean, that's all you got. I mean,
he does.
So, excuse me. So, whereas Barron has all of these commitments, I have all these commitments. I'm I have a job, you know what I mean, in an institution, and I have to, but that in part that's sort of my personality. But I just wonder, you have to be on, sort of team truth, right? You have to be sort of willing to kind of do that, and of course how you say it matters and all that sort of thing. But I'm always very conscious of what, who is asking me to tell a lie in public.
And I think that's one of the number one ways that we compromise ourselves.
Yeah.
Is either by wanting to please people, or out of fear that we'll run afoul of certain people. We just keep our mouths shut. And so, I did a certain amount of that kowtowing when I was an academic professor. Even though I had tenure and I could, in theory, say whatever I wanted to say, in reality, that's not entirely true. And so you don't want any Pyrrhic victories. You have to have the long view. And so sometimes you just have to zip it, right? And
zip it.
Yeah. So I'm not gonna go that way. So there's that. There's that kind of sort of inauthenticity where I'm going to hold back. But yeah, I've done my bit for King and Country, and I don't really care anymore about any of that. So yeah, I have the ability to sort of just say whatever comes to my mind, for good and for ill. I mean, sometimes I have said things even in my blog. I said, "Oh, I wish I hadn't said that."
Yeah, and look, that's all. That's part of the experience. I mean, I think that's how you're sort of learning your own sort of limits and your own tendencies and your own blind spots. I mean, I think we're trying to get better at this, and that really kind of brings me to the thing once again. I've had you now on this is our fourth show together. I keep wanting to talk about holiness, and if I were going to render a critique, yeah, Kale and Larry keep not talking about holiness because holiness is the hardest thing. So I need to wrap up this show today, but I really want to talk with you about
Yep.
what you talk about in that 3-part series. We got the Barron thing covered and the Peterson thing covered, but I really want to talk about the heaviness of God and the belief in God versus, you have this thing that you talk about that I think is so good, which is, we've gone to the sort of the strong, atheists of the Nietzschean era, right? Because he had a strong Christianity with which he was playing counter to.
Yep.
But now we live in the ordo of apathy. And I really, really think that that's an important idea that's worth, it's not that the question is no longer, does God exist or does he not exist? But I think you properly are seeing this as, does God matter? Which is a more profound and devastating question. Yeah, it doesn't even matter. And I
Yeah,
think that is
it's a
what
subtle
I
distinction.
confront.
We need to talk about that. What's the difference
Yeah,
between an atheist and one who simply says God doesn't matter?
yeah,
And God is unreal in this very, because atheism, by the very strength of its rejection, is actually in some ways implicitly affirming
that's
that
right.
which it rejects. So there's still a reality to God in the
Yeah,
atheistic rejection. But this indifference, this apathy, that's the unreality of God.
yeah.
We'll talk about that.
And I think it's the most devastating thing, and I think it's the great.
Yeah.
It's I think it's the fight. I don't know if even fight's the right word, but it's the challenge maybe of our time is that how do we fight? And it's not, as you say, it's not just acedia. It's not just, it's something more. It's like, and I look around and, it's not that my neighbor doesn't believe in God. It's that it's Sunday morning and there's just the big shrug of like, oh, whatever, it's Sunday morning. I mean,
And
that's it. Let's go get eggs.
the latest
So
research study that came out said 48% of
yeah,
millennials don't think the whole question even matters.
it
It's not
does.
that they don't believe in God. It's just like, who cares?
Like
Eh,
literally, who cares? And it's
who
like that.
cares?
That to me is the most sort of devastating one. But anyway, that's going to have to wait for our next show.
Uh,
Larry, I want to thank. I love doing this. I hope that we can keep doing it. My
yeah.
summer just started, so I think we can make this a bit
What's
of a
great too
regular
about this
gig.
episode is we didn't completely agree on one
Yeah,
issue, the sort of
yeah,
issue there, and yet
yeah.
we were able to amicably talk about it, and that's
Wow, imagine that. That's
yeah.
amazing, amazing stuff. All right. Well, Larry, thank you so much. Everybody, if you could do the whole like and subscribe thing, I'd appreciate it. I know I'm a small channel, a small time, but I'll post this on Facebook and Twitter, and please feel free to leave comments for me and Larry. We'd appreciate it. Take care and God bless.